Julian Assange, the man who endured the unbearable weight of exposing the truth, is finally free. Julian Assange, who was kept for 5 years in a maximum security prison in the UK without trial. Julian Assange, who spent 7 years living in the Ecuadorian Embassy to avoid extradition to Sweden for charges that were never filed. Julian Assange, who exposed war crimes and the corrupt practices of British and American intelligence services and their proxies worldwide. Julian Assange, the Australian journalist, founder of WikiLeaks.
Through WikiLeaks, Julian succeeded in terrorizing Big Brother.
Come on, fire!
He took Big Brother's technologies, constructed a digital mirror and turned it towards the face of Big Brother. So we, who are being watched by Big Brother, can watch Big Brother watching us. Nothing terrifies Big Brother more than that.
In nearly 15 years of activity, WikiLeaks has exposed millions of documents revealing what governments, political parties, and public and private institutions think, plan, and execute behind our backs. Tax evasion and money laundering, corruption, electoral scams, covert operations of questionable legality, global surveillance, hacking tools used without restrictions, human rights abuses, and the killing of journalists and civilians.
WikiLeaks as an organization is a very important example of moral defiance against an immoral authority.
In 2010, after the war logs of Iraq and Afghanistan, Julian's campaign against the hidden strings of our societies started to resonate in the high spheres of the US government. A criminal investigation into WikiLeaks was opened. That same year, 2 women accused Julian Assange of sexual assault and rape, leading to a Swedish arrest warrant. Assange denied the allegations and initially cooperated with the authorities. In June 2012, fearing that the accusations were politically motivated and could lead to extradition to the US for his role in WikiLeaks, Julian Assange sought refuge in the Ecuadorian Embassy in London. President Rafael Correa granted him asylum, and this is when the lengthy punishment for exposing the truth started.
The first 5 years in the embassy, he was most of the time alone in a very small closet space, but he was allowed to have, let's say, some possibilities of work and some possibilities of contact.
But even under these conditions, which were relatively mild compared to what Julian would face later, what kind of consequences can such a prolonged lockdown have on a person?
You have problems assessing time, problems assessing space, problems of keeping concentrated attention or with memory, because your life is very monotonous, because you're in a very closed space, you never look at a long distance, and this means that you have a deterioration of your cognitive abilities. So it's a chronic deterioration of all the senses and all the systems of the body because you don't use them.
After 5 years, Ecuador's new president, Lenin Moreno, sought to improve relations with the US and used Assange as leverage. Moreno cut Assange's internet access, placed him under video surveillance, shared the recordings with the press to humiliate him, and denied him visitors.
The last 2 years, in my view, is a torturing environment. This is conditions in which state is trying to coerce an individual by producing psychological and physical suffering. So for a purpose, which in this case is changing his will and pushing him to leave the embassy.
In April 2019, Ecuador revoked his asylum, leading to Julian's arrest for failing to appear in court. He was quickly convicted and sentenced to 50 weeks in prison. Shortly after his arrest, the US unsealed an indictment charging Assange with conspiracy to commit computer intrusion related to the 2010 release of classified military documents. Later, the US expanded the charges to include 17 counts under the Espionage Act. Assange was detained in Belmarsh, a high-security prison in London, often referred to as Britain's Guantanamo. In May 2019, as part of the UN Special Report on Torture, Professor Pau Perez visited Julian in Belmarsh.
Depressed, fearful, with suicide ideas, and with an attitude of vigilance in an environment which is hostile. You don't need to be a psychiatrist to understand that you are in front of a person who is psychologically and medically destroyed.
Julian spent more than 5 years in solitary confinement in Belmarsh. Isn't that considered torture?
When you are put for more than 15 days in solitary confinement, this is torture. It's because the medical studies show that when you are kept in those conditions for more than 15 days, there is damage in almost all people.
During the September 2020 extradition hearing, psychiatrist Professor Michael Kopelman testified that Assange displayed symptoms of depression, auditory hallucinations, and preoccupation with suicidal thoughts. This testimony, along with reports from the UN and doctors for Assange, highlighted the critical physical and mental condition of Julian Assange at that time. Despite all this evidence, why he had to spend another 4 years in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison.
At the end, you understand that this is not part of a legal process. This is what we would say a lawfare process in which there are other reasons for keeping you under these conditions.
So how can we be so vocal, eloquent, and critical when another country engages in similar behavior toward its citizens, yet remain compliant and silent when it happens in our own?
We don't need to go to Iran, we don't need to go to Russia. We can also look around us to see these cases. Of course, the case of Julian is an extreme case, imposing a kind of severe punishment to him, because this case is an example for others to be aware of what happens if you don't follow certain rules.
Julian Assange's case was used to send a stark message from the shadows of our governments. Do not interfere in our affairs. It's a clear and loud threat aimed at journalists, activists, politicians, and anyone who may dare confront the power behind the curtains.
I think it's only about freedom of press. It's about the right of citizens to know, the right to know the truth.
Julian Assange is now finally free, hopefully recovering fast. But the dark legacy that WikiLeaks and his case exposed will remain. The doubts toward our governments, the suspicion that our democratic societies are just parades in a carnival of lies, the concern that our journalists live in fear of saying the truth, the never-ending wars.
Very soon, within the next few years, it will become the normal for there to be a constant war in the West. People will reach maturity and adulthood under the understanding that there is always a war.